Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the second of our double bill today. We talked about crime in Berlin earlier today, but now we are back to the subject of World War II and Britain. And because Churchill looms so large in our understanding of the war, we sometimes overlook the powerful men in his close circle. Two of Winston's bandits were Max Aitken, otherwise known as Lord Beaverbrook, and Frederick Lindemann, two men with plenty to say about many subjects. But today we will look at their sometimes opposing views about aircraft production, air power, how to win the war. And I welcome my guest, Adrian Phillips, who's written several books that kind of cover this subject. But the one, Winston's Bandits, is the one that's most appropriate today. But there's also a link below to his previous book about aircraft production. But I'll bring him in now. Good evening, Adrian. How are you today?
Good evening, Paul.
So, with Churchill, and I said there, his incredible influence over everything we talk about. Churchill is pretty much the 20th century. His Churchill. Does it mean that we are avoiding talking about these people around him? And Clement Attlee we talk about because he was a prime minister post-war, but these incredible figure that you talk about in your book, we should be talking about them more. I assume that's what you think.
Absolutely. I think they're crucial to understanding Churchill both as a person and in his war effort. It's very easy to forget. We have Churchill right up there on a pillar, one of the great figures in history, one of the top 100 historical figures of all time. But you lose track of the fact that he was a human being. And in fact, compared to a lot of major political leaders, he was extremely human. He was warm, he was gushing, he loved the good things of life. And this is where it's important. He needed friends. He was a man of friendship. And the guys that I've written about here were his friends. That was the crucial thing, personal friendship. Churchill needed individuals he felt comfortable with, that he could strike sparks off. It wasn't that he ran a chumocracy. It wasn't that he just needed purely subordinates and people who were completely tied to him individually. He needed generals, he needed politicians, he needed civil servants from the existing establishment. But at a human level, he needed guys that he was comfortable with, both for his own psychological reasons and also because there were specific tasks that were necessary in the war effort that he thought these guys were the ones to carry out.
And I think we will talk about later on. I think sometimes we assume that because he has such kind of staunch enemies and such really close friends that he wasn't able to just, in a sense, have people that he would argue with. And that's, when you get to a certain level of friendship, you can have arguments. That's what that a certain mateship, the Australians would call it, wouldn't, where you can have disagreements, and that's how you make your decisions. I remember that advice Eisenhower gave to JFK about, don't just surround yourself with people who, lackeys. Have people who will oppose you and stand up and get those engagements going, because that's ultimately how you make decisions. But we're looking at the early part of the war specifically, and we all know that Great Britain is starting off on a fairly sticky wicket in terms of numbers of everything. We're lacking shipping, we're lacking personnel, we're lacking aircraft, we're lacking. So take us to, we've got some slides there. You can kind of give us a bit of introduction to things, and then we'll kind of open to a more of a loose chat. So take us through these individuals that you wrote about.
Yeah, we're going to focus on two guys who were long-standing friends, long-standing collaborators of Churchill. When he became Prime Minister in May 1940, there was specific work that he wanted them to do that was vital to the war effort, and he brought them in as his men. They sort of stayed with him. They carried out their work, but they kept their personal relationships with him. And the first one we're talking about is Max Aitken, Lord Beaverbrook. He, and this is possibly a slightly controversial view, he is one of the people who had a psychological edge over Churchill. when they first really got to know each other in the First World War, Churchill was, as you can see in the middle picture, fighting on the Western Front, and he wanted to get back to politics in Westminster. And Beaverbrook was the man who was the link to Andrew Bonar Law, leader of the Conservatives, who was the figure with the power to say yay or nay to that decision. So at that stage, at the real beginning of their relationship, Churchill was rather the underdog. It was Beaverbrook who had the whip hand. And I think that gave him an advantage that he had for the rest of his life, the rest of their relationship. Churchill certainly needed him psychologically, but I'd go so far as to say that it was something of an abusive relationship, and Beaverbrook did misbehave himself and play on it. When he was brought in to the Churchill government in 1940, as you're saying, there was a crippling need to improve British aircraft production. And Churchill thought that Beaverbrook was the guy to do it. Now, Churchill was, and this is again possibly a slightly controversial argument, I think Churchill was exaggerating the extent to which British aircraft production was lagging. In fact, when you look at this chart, you can see that from the beginning of 1940, there is a very sharp improvement in fighter output. This was well underway, and also the resources, the factories were there to make this production. What Churchill was confronted with, though, when he was in Chamberlain's war cabinet, was a rather complacent, lethargic presentation of how aircraft production was going. And coupled with some very confusing and baffling figures, to the extent that Churchill started talking about muddle and scandal in aircraft production. Yes, things were a bit lethargic. Yes, things could do with a kick, but Churchill was rather exaggerating that. He also needed a political ally, because when Churchill became prime minister, he was a man pretty much on his own in the cabinet. The Labour Party, he knew that Labour needed to be brought into national government genuinely to create a proper war effort, but he knew well that Labour were not his friends, nor for that matter were the Conservatives. So he needed a political friend, at least one political friend, who could punch hard. So Beaverbrook was doing the two jobs for him. He was looking after aircraft production, and he was also the political mate in cabinet. Beaverbrook certainly did quite a bit for aircraft production. Though whether it was Beaverbrook personally or the fact that suddenly, when Hitler was mopping up all of Europe, suddenly it became possible to work 3 shifts in factories and work over the weekend, is an open question. And certainly when you look at the way fighter production soared up, this happens, very, very quickly. And whether a single individual could have achieved this kind of rise in in aircraft output in a fortnight is an open question. Certainly, Beaverbrook was supplying the dynamism that lay behind it, but there was a lot more than Beaverbrook's efforts behind it. The other point to this part of the story is that Beaverbrook certainly knew how to exaggerate his own achievements. Here we have a little quotation from the beginning of 1941, when he's telling Churchill, when you came into office, you had practically no fighters left. That's what your predecessor had left you. That was absolute rubbish. and there was 99 Hurricanes and more in Britain and more in France and 247 Spitfires. The extraordinary thing is that Beaverbrook was prepared to come up with this kind of rubbish, and that Churchill did not challenge him, which rather goes back to my assessment of the balance of power between the two men. And here he was going to come into conflict, Beaverbrook, with the other figure we'll be talking about, Professor Frederick Lindemann, Churchill's scientific advisor, who had been with him arguing for greater air rearmament before the war, and also in a broader sense providing scientific input into what Churchill was saying. Lindemann was a scientist. He was quite a distinguished physicist. He also knew about aeronautics as a First World War aeronautical science. He'd come up with a solution for aircraft going into spins, which was at that stage almost invariably fatal. And he'd worked this out theoretically. And then he took up a DH-2 biplane and deliberately put it into a spin to see whether his method worked to get the plane out of a spin. So he had that factor, physical courage, which Churchill very, very much admired. And as Churchill was fighting a campaign for Britain to rearm, to provide an active air defence rather than simply a counter-bombing defence, Lindemann was at his side. Lindemann was the scientific heavyweight who was firing on Churchill's behalf. The catch was that Lindemann's scheme for air defence was cockeyed. He thought that aerial mines were the solution to defending against bombers, which they weren't really, but it became a joint obsession of Churchill and Lindemann. And when you look at the problems that Churchill had trying to get air rearmament through before the war, it doesn't help when you've got somebody arguing for a method that is unproven and actually unworkable. So what you really needed was what you have here, the fighter control rooms and radar. That was what was going to solve the problem ultimately. But when Lindemann came in, first of all to Churchill's Admiralty and then into number 10 Downing Street, he provided another aspect of war management, which was actually very important. Statistics. That was Lindemann's title. His operation was the statistical section. And in practice, he was Churchill's Rottweiler in Whitehall. When a ministry, say the Air Ministry, came up with baffling statistics which proved they were doing all right, Lindemann's job was to burrow into what lay behind those numbers, and with Churchill behind him, he was able to rip into ministries in a way that nobody else was. The perverse thing was that there was one minister who was exempt, or pretty much exempt, from Lindemann's attentions, which was Beaverbrook. I go back to what I was saying about what was the figure that Beaverbrook came up with statistics. He was pretty much the one man who was allowed to get away with that stuff, though I think we'll get to it in the conversation. It was a long-running sore. Well, one of the subtitles that was suggested by the publisher for the book was Churchill's Band of Brothers, which I rather firmly rejected because A, it had been done to death, and B, because it was completely inaccurate. There was no great friendship between the Bandits, and indeed the relationship between Lindemann and Beaverbrook was downright poisonous. They each worked rather off the motto, you can't have too many enemies, though they were anything but brothers.
It seems to me, Adrian, that the Churchill is almost like the hub of a wheel, and he has all these people around the wheel, but they're not. He's the link between them all, isn't he? That's the thing. It's not that, as you say, that they may or may not agree with each other, but he is crucial, the linchpin of it all. There, in that regard, is that a fair assessment?
Yes, but one thing I would make a great point of, uh, Hitler operated on a divide and rule basis.
Yeah.
He worked on the basis of all against all. He deliberately fomented conflict between his inner circle as a way of staying in charge. Churchill did not. That was
Mm.
not his tactic. He knew he was the boss. He knew that ultimately he was going to call the shots. So he was not worried to have people fighting to validate that. He certainly appreciated friction between the people working for him as a method of uh, creative tension.
Mm.
Um, and so he did not bother to be emollient and to manufacture apparent harmony when there was none really. Um, but no, he was not like Hitler creating a war of all against all.
Yeah. So I want to go back. We'll talk about both of the figures again, but let's go to Lord Beaverbrook first, because in some ways he's a modern person, in that he had global influence as a press baron. I mean, we're in an era now of the Elon Musks and the those kind of individuals who have huge influence, maybe more than they should have. But he's from that sort of style, isn't he? So as a press baron, you don't want to have you want headlines, you want big stories, big things. And the thing about the aircraft production is that in 1940 we now sort of realize that it was evolution rather than revolution. The air defense plan had been in place for several years before 1939-40, but the way Sir Churchill and others sort of sold it in the Battle of Britain was this sort of wonderful thing they'd pulled together out of sealing wax and string, and it was the plucky Brits things. But it's a lot longer than that. But Beaverbrook knew the power of as a headline. So is that part of why he's able to, should we say, massage some of the figures? Is that his press background that gives him that skill?
And certainly he is able to promote things. I mean, he gets a very, very good press as Minister of Aircraft Production and onwards, for obvious reasons. And when he goes out of office, he has a guy from his staff who is perfectly willing to write a book more or less at his dictation, called "The Sky's the Limit." Um, setting up the legend of Beaverbrook as the master of aircraft production, as the man who achieves this miracle personally. No, he's got that on his side, and from the point of view of the war leadership, the point of view of Churchill, getting excitement, getting positive sentiment is important. For instance, Beaverbrook's pots and pans
Mm.
drive, in which aluminium cookware was collected, supposedly to be melted down into Spitfires. That was ludicrous as a source of raw material, and whether it was any value at all is doubtful. But where it did work was to create uh, the sense of urgency, and urgency was one of Beaverbrook's favorite words. That people had to make individual sacrifices of their cookware, um, and from a national level, it fostered a sense of solidarity and effort. So in practical terms, it was limited or zero value, but in psychological propaganda terms,
Yeah.
it was very valuable.
Yeah, I broke my poor granny's heart years ago when I told her that her frying pan did not get used to make a Spitfire, and she was very upset with me for spoiling her part of the war effort there. But we had a question from Gary August earlier I'll just read it as it is. Were the shackles of the Air Ministry removed with Churchill's influence or Aitken's own obstinance to their interference around production? So this is, this back to this idea of revolutionary evolution. So was the Air Ministry sort of dragging its heels? Did Beaverbrook make a big difference, or was that part of his own PR thing? What's your take?
I would have said that it was probably 80% PR,
Right.
20% actual contribution. He certainly contributed disorganization, because there was a perfectly good unit within the Air Ministry, which was split off into the Ministry of Aircraft Production. Under Kingsley Wood, it had perhaps been a little too laid back, who knows? And the kicking people into action certainly was desirable. But at one level, which I'll come to, Beaverbrook was actively damaging in aircraft production. But whether he got 10% more out of the machine that wouldn't have been there, I wouldn't put it any higher than that. But he certainly made a positive contribution to output of fighters, which I would stress that now.
Mm. So with this, we called the show, urgency versus statistics. Now I want to get to Lindemann later on, because one of the things we've talked about several times on the channel, notably with Alan Allport last year, is the Battle of the Atlantic was never quite the close run thing that popular myth says it was. Yes, it was crucial. Yes, it was the most crucial long campaign of World War II, but supplies were getting through, and that has been borne out by the data, by the statistics, and I think we can be discuss that later on. But as you said there, Beaverbrook, Aitken, if we prefer, is got this sense of the now, that how to galvanize anything, you need that big effort, that big headline, that punchy kind of quotation. So that is that at the heart of the two gentlemen and their disagreements, is that they have a, is it that Beaverbrook has like a short-term approach where Lindemann has a long-term approach? Is that simplifying it too much?
They'd got very, very different ways of approaching the problem. Not so much in the nature of the problem, of the way of dealing with it. Beaverbrook worked on the basis of dealing with everything as a crisis, as something which could be solved by brutal action in a very short space of time. Lindemann understood that you were talking about long-term management issues, which were very important. But ultimately, he was prepared to take as brutal a view on what the right solution was as Beaverbrook. They ultimately were men of, I won't say absolutes, but they were people who would not equivocate on what the solution was that was required. It was how that solution was to be achieved and implemented that they fell out.
Because I think now we look back, it seems obvious that the rallying cries of 1940 were going to lead to the eventual victory that came around in 1945, and of course the Allies were going to win. And but back in the early part of the war, that wasn't so certain. And what was definitely the case is that there were differences of opinions of how it should be fought. And I'm thinking particularly about whether or not the Soviet Union should be brought into the Allied way of thinking. Should they be allowed to wage their own war? Where does Lend-Lease fit in? And Churchill has a somewhat complicated relationship with Stalin. So what sort of things are Beaverbrook and Lindemann telling Churchill, and indeed some of the other bandits in that kind of 1940 period, about how to win the war? And what is Churchill taking on board from that, and what is he dismissing?
Both Beaverbrook and Lindemann were very in favor of the Soviet war effort. They understood that that was important. They understood that it needed to be fostered. The dynamics, though, of those decisions were quite different. At its most cynical, Beaverbrook saw acting as the spokesman for the Soviet war effort as a method of outflanking the Labour Party on the left. One of his bugbears in running the economy, in running wartime production, was that because the Labour Party controlled the labour market, they had a very, very big say on resource allocation. And Beaverbrook absolutely hated that. And when the Soviet Union came into the war, you can make an argument that setting himself up as the spokesman of the Soviets was his way of saying, if you want real socialism, if you want the Soviets really on your side, I'm your man, not the namby-pamby Labour Party. And ultimately, that didn't work as a political strategy. As I said, Lindemann was also in favour of helping the Soviets, simply because he sat down, did the sums, and the most efficient way of killing Germans was to keep Russia in the war, which was closer to Churchill's own approach, which was very, very pragmatic. He viscerally hated socialism. He viscerally hated the Soviet Union, but he knew that to win the war, you needed Stalin. So get on with it.
With Lindemann, I think the first thing that came to my head is his belief that the V2 bomb later in the war was a ruse by the Germans. There was no such thing, which makes him look a bit comical. And I think from what I was reading and research for this, there has been a tendency to make him look a little bit of a buffoon. I'm thinking about the Trevor Howard portrayal in the film Operation Crossbow, where he ends up getting proved wrong by Duncan Sandys, played by Richard Johnson, I think it was. So is Lindemann deserving of more of a fairer crack of the whip these days?
Generally, yes. And on the V2 question, he was actually right. His science was on the nail, saying that the most you could deliver was a warhead of 1 ton, which was militarily pointless. Just the Germans were prepared to make that sacrifice. Where he erred was that he approached the question in a polemical and aggressive way. He actually hampered the intelligence effort by being overly aggressive, by not saying, well, this is the most that a rocket could do. Let's explore whether this is an open option. So he was right, but he was wrong. Some of his other decisions were absolutely on the nail. He had a long fight with the General Staff about whether it was more efficient to ship vehicles to mainly the Middle East in kit form or assembled form. And there he was exactly right that it was the way to save shipping space, and it didn't matter if it used a bit more labor when they were landed. And on other things, he was probably 60% right. The two questions in particular which relate to aircraft production is that Lindemann was very much in favor of the strategic bombing strategy. He wanted the maximum resources committed to that. He was singing off the same song sheet as the air staff of the Royal Air Force, and he was very much in opposition to Beaverbrook on that. And also, in the Battle of the Atlantic, he wanted long-range aircraft retained for bombing Germany rather than used against the U-boats. Now, probably in an overall picture, it would have been better to have more air resource devoted to the Battle of the Atlantic, but it's kind of on the margin, 10 or 15% more. And because you're actually talking about 2 or 3 specific battles, which needed long-term planning to fight, the decision had already been made in 1936 even. So that battle had been fought already. But in terms of the fight between the air staff and the Admiralty, Lindemann was very much the ally of the air staff.
Is Lindemann, we talk a lot these days, or people talk a lot about whether or not someone like Field Marshal Montgomery was on the spectrum. Was he autistic, or Asperger's, something like that? And the wise people say, well, it's impossible, of course, to go back, and without proper medical analysis, you can't go back and speculate about someone's disposition to these things decades ago. But Lindemann, because he's statistically based, because he's looking at data, he's data driven, he's also clearly very confident of his own skills as a physicist, as a scientist. Does that mean that he's maybe not open to accepting he might be right about the science, but wrong about the emotional response to some of the things he was saying? Because we're going back to this idea about the fact that whether or not the Battle of Atlantic was a close run thing. The fact is that the general public, for example, did think it was a close run thing. The Battle of Britain, people in Kent thought it was a close run thing. So is Lindemann a bit guilty of not seeing that there has to be an emotional balance? You have to understand what people are thinking, and that just pointing at the figures can just end up, in a sense, more pissing people off.
Oh, absolutely. Well, going back to the V2, somebody with greater people skills, to use a modern phrase, could have done a lot better selling his view of the science involved in the V2s. He could have done a lot better selling some of his views internally, but in terms of the mix of individuals involved in the war effort, it probably didn't hurt, except in very localized things, to have aggressive, overconfident, super arrogant individuals, because you had wonderful people like Hastings Ismay, as arch smoothers, arch compromise seekers. You had another figure from the political civil service world who's almost unheard of, but he was the master of Whitehall during the war, Sir John Anderson, who was the world's greatest committee man. Beaverbrook loathed committees, and Lindemann was barely any better. But in terms of how the committees in Whitehall functioned, there was Sir John Anderson to keep the machine going. Like, one of the sillier bits of panic that was caused when Beaverbrook came back into government in 1943 was he was given Sir John Anderson's old job, and some of the dumber people thought, oh dear, he will be taking over Anderson's committee world, lock, stock and barrel. Impossible. Beaverbrook loathed committees, as I said. The committees continued, some stronger, some weaker, but the structure was there. There was a hugely robust bureaucratic machine in place, which could easily manage one or two, if not a fair number, of rogue individuals.
Lots of questions coming in. I've got lots of questions for you as well. My first one, I'm going to ask you about: is there a way of working Churchill, so to speak, if you're part of his inner circle, is there a particular way that you can go into a meeting with, be it formally, be it informally, and kind of get your point across? Is there a particular way he doesn't like? Does he, you know, in modern parlance, would he hate a PowerPoint presentation with graphs and chat? What was anybody masterful at kind of getting one over on Churchill? Was Churchill always the savvy person that we think he was?
The absolute key to getting Churchill's respect in any debate was, well, aggression is possibly not quite the word, but Churchill wanted people who did not equivocate, who came up with a point of view hard and argued it, whatever the seniority of the person they might be arguing it against, even if that person was Churchill himself.
Right.
To go off at a small tangent, I think one of the great shames of the war is that Wavell was never prepared to enter a screaming match with Churchill, and I think had he been, he would have worked a lot better with him. But no, Churchill did not like equivocation. Churchill did not like the soft approach. So to work with Churchill, you had to be hard-nosed.
Yeah, I mean, the very idea of going in and sticking your ground with Churchill looking at you with that sourpuss face he could do, it terrified me. I mean, I'm getting sweats just thinking about sort of standing my ground there, and then my inner voice telling me, no, don't back down, because if you back down, you've lost, clearly. We've got a couple of questions from the viewers. So this is one specifically about Beaverbrook's Canadianness. And Norma Graham, one of our regular Canadian viewers, did Beaverbrook's Canadian ties lead to the rapid growth in war industries in Canada? Good question.
I don't think so at all. Beaverbrook was Canadian by origin. He still had some ties in Canada, but there was still a very poor relationship between him and the Canadian establishment, going right back to things like the Canadian Cement Affair before the First World War. And in fact, one of his big punch-ups as Minister of Aircraft Production was against Canada. He loathed the idea of British pilots being trained in Canada and wanted that scheme knocked on the head. And it was actually a very useful and positive contribution to the war effort that Canada was making, and his misbehavior, I think, risked compromising it.
Yeah, a good point. Peter O'Connell wants to know about how does RV Jones come into this with Lindemann, and another fascinating figure. Do you have an opinion about him?
Jones was a very good scientist, also quite effective self-publicist. And it goes back to what we were saying about needing a positive and direct approach, well, not necessarily to stand up to Churchill, but in a presentation with Churchill. When there was uncertainty about how the German bombers were navigating to attack Britain at night time, it was Jones, supported by Lindemann, who understood the importance of the navigation beams that the German Air Force was using. So there, Jones was absolutely on the money, and Lindemann supported him. It was when we get into the V2 territory that Jones is a professional intelligence officer and understands as well as being a scientist, and understands that you have to go look at the data empirically. You cannot just work from scientific calculation and say, that is the reality, that is the only thing that matters, which is what Lindemann was doing. That's where Lindemann was wrong. And Jones was right. And in fact, when the volume of evidence is getting so huge that Lindemann looks like he's going to humiliate himself, Jones does try to rescue him from that, but Lindemann does rather stick to his guns.
But I'm really enjoying this. I'm glad you're a fan of Ismay. I'm a big fan of Ismay and the Casablanca conference and things like that. But going back to Beaverbrook, we were talking before going live about how much is written about Churchill, and Beaverbrook less so, obviously. But there's ways of looking at Beaverbrook's career from a positive way or negative way, because he does have a variety of roles in World War II. So a naysayer can say, well, he gets moved around a bit because he's not very good. And someone who looks at the positives of it goes, oh, well, he's moved around because he's fighting fires. What his career, Ministry of Supply, aviation, aircraft production. How do you view how Churchill used him in the war? Did he not want him to stay in for too long in one role? What's your take on his moving around, if that's not a weird way of describing it?
I think the motivation came from the other direction. I think that Beaverbrook knew that his methods had a limited shelf life.
Right.
Plus, going back to what I described as the abusive relationship between Beaverbrook and Churchill, Beaverbrook was very happy to use threats of resignation. I think the number of times he threatened to resign as Minister of Aircraft Production was about 15. And finally, that was accepted. And I think that Beaverbrook also knew that he'd done his stuff. He knew that he was not able to come up with the heavy bombers which were required for the offensive against Germany. He knew that the air staff had his number on that. He knew that Portal had his card marked, and the Air Ministry, the Ministry of Aircraft Production, was only going to get less comfortable for Beaverbrook. So I think he knew that the time had come to move on. Churchill, the initiative to broaden his remit to other forms of war production came very much from Churchill. The catch was that Churchill was a pragmatist enough to know that Labour was going to be had to be a permanent part of it, and you could not have Beaverbrook method completely overriding Labour. Beaverbrook would have been allowed 70% of what he wanted, but that was not enough. And so at the beginning of 1942, we finally have the showdown, which sees Beaverbrook taken out of government. And
sorry.
And this is where the relationship with Lindemann could be crucial. As well as their other fights, Beaverbrook was fighting over a bit of turf or two bits of turf that Lindemann had built up. One was the Ministry of Unconventional Warfare, and the other one was the development of rocket weaponry, both of which had, for essentially historical reasons, fallen into Lindemann's remit. Beaverbrook wanted to take them over. Churchill was inclined to give in, and this is the point where Lindemann threw his toys out of the pram and said, if you're going to let this happen, if you're going to let Beaverbrook run the war effort with no exposure to statistical examination of what he's up to. I am off. I will draw your charts for you, but that's it. I am going. Now, he wasn't the only one who was saying it would be a good idea to get rid of Beaverbrook at the time, but I'd argue that his was one of the decisive voices that made Churchill bow to I think probably the inevitable, and let Beaverbrook leave government in February 1942.
This is absolutely fascinating. I mean, so enjoying this. You mentioned Labour back there. Ian Carr had the question, would Beaverbrook or Lindemann have encountered Attlee regularly, who chaired meetings when Churchill was often abroad? And of course, how was their relationship with him? Because you've already painted that Beaverbrook particularly not a great fan of the Labour Party. So how did they get on with Attlee?
Um, Attlee was not so much the important figure that Beaverbrook had to deal with. It was Ernest Bevin, the
I was going
Minister
to
of
ask about
Labour,
Bevin. Yeah.
who was the real bugbear for Beaverbrook. But in the final showdown in early 1942, Beaverbrook did try and take out Attlee as well, and that was pretty suicidal. Lindemann was no fan of socialism at all, but he operated at a much lower level politically. I can't actually think of that much contact between him and any of the Labour leaders.
Okay.
And there he was pretty much cold-blooded. Labour was a resource to be handled as necessary. The one point on which he did lean in a soft Labour direction is that when there were voices calling for more and more rigour, more and more austerity, less and less effort to be devoted to material comforts of individuals. Cherwell, or Lindemann, was prepared to say, no, I think morale is important. His calculations were not coming up with any huge release of additional resource by cutting back on personal consumption. So he backed Churchill's, I think, gut instinct that there was only so much austerity that the public could take, and that in terms of, if it's a question of 1% more measurable output and 10% less morale, the morale is more important than the output. So Lindemann is surprising. I won't say socialist, but Lindemann is surprisingly human and inclined to look at the national morale and psyche. So in the broadest sense, he was probably aligned with Labour there, but not personally.
Okay, two questions specifically about Lindemann. So Rob is asking, does Adrian have a view on Solly Zuckerman and J.D. Burnell's claim that Lindemann deliberately skewed their research into bombing effectiveness in order to con Churchill into area bombing? So pretty forthright question there.
I don't think there was any necessity to move Churchill in favour of the bombing offensive against Germany. Right from his entry into Downing Street, Churchill knew that bombing was the best way of delivering military force against Germany. He knew it was pretty much the only way that was available. And given his insistence on aggression of offensive warfare, Churchill was pro-bombing from the word go. There was obviously a very large debate within Whitehall about how and how much to bomb. And I think Solly Zuckerman had a slightly more subtle view. in what came to be called the area bombing directive than Churchill. Sorry, than Lindemann. In terms of the actual debate as to whether bombing could be the prime target for resources, the guy who actually swung the decision was, I think, Bomber Harris, because he was the guy who was in charge when Bomber Command went from being negligible, because right the way through to well into 1942, Bomber Command wasn't achieving anything worthwhile. It actually took, I think the crucial moment was the Cologne raid.
Yeah.
To demonstrate that, yes, the RAF could hit Germany hard. Yes, there was the scientific debate in the background, and yes, Lindemann was probably wildly exaggerating and coming out with completely arbitrary obiter dicta rather than scientific arguments. But in terms of what kept the bombing offensive on the road, I think it was results and not argument.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. And I remember the discussion I had with Australian historian Robin Pryor about area bombing and strategic bombing, and that people's definitions of what is even meant by area bombing was different from one individual to another, and that we're burdened with this linguistic nuance of what the hell are we even talking about? What is aerial bombing? What is strategic bombing? And that's a massive rabbit hole we're not going to go down tonight, because we're not talking about strategic bombing as such, although it is fascinating. Another question, I've got a couple, then I've got from a viewer, then I've got some from me. So Peter O'Connor saying, how connected was Lindemann with the Manhattan Project? So it's on his Wikipedia entry, because I read that today. I mean, we tend to think of the Brits doing jets and the Americans doing atomic, but it's obviously not quite as simple as that. Lindemann, the Manhattan Project, how much was he involved?
He was, well, there were two guys, Sir John Anderson, who was civil servant, politician, and also a scientist, and Lindemann. They were the two guys who were at the top of the tree of the political management of the British involvement in the Manhattan Project, and to the extent that Churchill, who was generally aware, referred to the Manhattan Project or British involvement as Anderson's affair. They were the inputs in favour of a British effort, but again, what they came up against was Churchill's grasp of the big picture. He knew that the relationship with F.D. Roosevelt was vital, and he knew that ultimately pretty much anything would have to be sacrificed to keep that relationship going. There's a big argument as to whether Churchill was naive in trusting Roosevelt to deliver fair play. But it's certainly the one topic on which I think he had a stand-up row with Lindemann. But ultimately, it was Churchill's calculation of the importance of the US relationship and what had to be done to keep it going that mattered. And whilst Lindemann was in favour of as large a British contribution as possible, he was cold-blooded enough to know that the economic resource was simply not there to be anything other than a junior partner to the US.
I'm so enjoying this. You mentioned Churchill and the big picture there, and when we look at his management of the cabinet of Great Britain in many ways, the entire Allied effort for the first couple of years of the war, is does that management of these egos around him and these characters, does it come naturally? When we talk about Eisenhower, which I do a lot, we talk about his seemingly natural ability to just get the best out of people and keep all these hotheads like Patton and de Gaulle and other in check by sort of 43, 44. But does Churchill have to work at his management of these people, or is it natural, or is it a bit of both?
Churchill had been around as a politician for a long time, but his actual involvement in politics was relatively limited. He had very little, he'd been very little involved in things where there was much political process, where there was much low-grade political give and take.
Mm.
So, to a great extent, he was he was not unaware of what was going on when he got the top job, but it was all pretty new to him. Allied to the fact that it was the problems that were having to be dealt with were so urgent, so large, and so unexpected that there wasn't much of a roadmap.
Mm.
So he had to make do with what he had. The example I'm very fond of quoting is that Churchill promoted himself Minister of Defence. From the word go, he said, I shall be in charge of the war effort. The service ministers are in a junior position. One person has to decide on war strategy. And he knew he would need some staff backup to do it. And in the first couple of days, he was planning to set up a defence office specifically to deal with the Ministry of Defence. But then he discovered that one existed already. That's to say, the defence side of the Cabinet Secretariat under Hastings Ismay. So that part of the machine that Churchill needed was there already, in the hands of somebody he'd had practically no dealings with, he'd had practically no sense of. And it was just one of the great pieces of good fortune that Ismay was a strong enough character and able enough to deliver a Ministry of Defence which had existed virtually under Maurice Hankey, even. He had the levers that the bureaucratic levers that Churchill needed to pull. And Churchill had no problem at all using that machine when he was understood that it was there at his disposal and it was friendly towards him.
That's an interesting point about Churchill himself being sometimes unaware of the tools in his toolbox when he came to power in 1940, and that leads me to ask you: are we now, 8 decades on, a little bit guilty of thinking that from the moment Churchill becomes PM, everything just changes, and he kind of goes in, and metaphorically, all the desks get swept of all the papers, all the people get ousted, and a completely new organizational force comes in? Are we kind of guilty of thinking of that? Because that's sort of what Churchill was projecting himself. This revolution rather than evolution. Are we guilty of thinking about that way sometimes?
It's certainly a wild exaggeration. In politics, the revolution was bringing the Labour Party in. The Conservative Party with whom he had to work was the party that he knew and which loathed him. So there was no change there. In Whitehall itself, possibly the only major step he took was to boot Sir Horace Wilson out of number 10 Downing Street, where he was de facto the cabinet secretary or chief of staff, call it what you will, which was, and he'd become an institution, but that was an outgrowth of a personal relationship with Chamberlain. Structurally, very little change. And the only really revolutionary thing he did was to set up the Ministry of Aircraft Production, which involved carving a large chunk out of the Air Ministry. But no, otherwise he took over a machine that was already present, energized it, subject it to criticism and examination. Here we come back to Lindemann's role as the Rottweiler getting the statistics that the boss wants. But the actual structure of the machine stayed pretty constant. And yes, there were changes in personnel, but much less brutal than either Stalin or Hitler implemented.
And I think we're back to this, what we talked about right at the beginning of this idea that Churchill does loom so large. He wrote prolifically over the whole of his career, and I'm not saying he put the glory on his own shoulders, but he certainly didn't deflect attention away from himself. He knew he liked to be the center of things. But I think we as students of World War II need to understand that he's good at picking a team. It is a team effort, and these people around him with their differing opinions and their differing ambitions and methodology, I think, is very important. So, kind of to wind things out, we with Churchill, we talked about before going live, over 1,000 biographies of Churchill now, and we've covered him several times on the channel. Where are we in the historiography? I mean, are we better at understanding Churchill? Can you even understand? I mean, you can't sum up Churchill in a tweet. You can't sum him up in a few words. But where are we in just understanding who the hell he was?
I think to some extent, in the last few years, we've gone backwards. Rather in keeping with a lot of things that are happening in public debate, not just about history, there has been a polarization towards extremes, towards a conflictual approach towards. So you have this notion that you're either for Churchill or against him, which to me is nonsense. Churchill did some very good stuff, and he did some very bad stuff. And it was the same guy who did it. How you balance the two against each other is a question of personal judgment. But you have to look at what actually happened. You cannot say Churchill was somebody who did things invariably well or invariably badly. You have to come back from the facts, from the reality, and form your opinion on what happened, on what you can see happening, rather than going forward from the individual, or more accurately, a prejudice about the individual.
I mean, with the length of career he had, it would be impossible for him to have gone through the whole of that without some very low troughs and some equally high peaks and some kind of mediocrity in the middle, filling it all out. I mean, that's, when we look at some of the commanders we discuss in World War II, if you end up being, I don't know, a brigadier for a week in 1940, during that week, you can have an incredibly brilliant week or an incredibly bad week, and you can be judged on that single week. But decades of political career, it would be ridiculous to try and sum it all up and not accept that he's a very, very complicated figure. But to bring it back to these figures, the Churchill, the Winston's Bandits you talked about, when you began the research on the book, or in your career generally, has your opinion of some of these people changed? Are you fixed in your ideas about them, or are they all so complicated that you're constantly kind of absorbing new information, new opinions?
The Bandits were, generally speaking, much simpler individuals. I feel I can sort of put my arms around them and make broad statements about them. Churchill, much harder. One thing which you will encounter dealing with any politician is, what is the balance between political opportunism and genuine principle in their considerations, with a third dimension in Churchill's case, curating his own legend, which is a factor, and many people find it extremely disagreeable. But It was there. So you're really balancing three things with Churchill: actual judgment, um, curating the legend, and what he thinks will be good politically.
Mm.
The other figures, much less so. It's more what they tell you about him psychologically. As I said,
Yeah.
Beaverbrook provided a boost, provided a psychological stimulation, and to some extent, authority over Churchill.
Mm.
Lindemann advised directly, openly, and with scientific knowledge behind him, which Churchill knew he didn't have. Brendan Bracken, who we've not talked about, would have screaming matches with Churchill, but yet he was utterly loyal. He would shout at Churchill, but Churchill knew that he would never do anything
Mm.
against him.
Mm.
These were the people that Churchill wanted and needed around him. And I think they looking at them not only tells you, as we've been doing this evening, about how the British war effort was structured and how the British war machine functioned, but also how Churchill functioned as an individual.
Yeah. And I think not just as an individual, as a team player, because I think, echoing what I've said already, I think we maybe are guilty of thinking that he does run a kind of a benign dictatorship, and that Churchill is such an influential figure, everything goes his way, and it's always, no, we're doing it. And clearly he does surround himself with people who do give advice that is sometimes conflicting. But to bring things to an end, I made my analogy of Churchill being the center of the wheel there, and these men are the spokes around it. It's a bit of a kind of a crass interviewer's question, but in your research of Winston's Bandits, is there one of them that you think without whom winning the war would have been that much harder? Is there one person that you think without him, without that person's influence and guidance, the effort to win would have been much greater?
Now, and when you're absolutely ruthless about it, I don't think any of them had a decisive
Right.
influence on actual military strategy. On balance, I think Lindemann made the greatest personal contributions, but we wouldn't have lost the war without him.
Mm.
I think in terms of, I'm slightly arguing against the looking at the Bandits, but when you look at how the Second World War was fought, the chiefs of staff as a
Yeah.
body was far more important
Yeah.
and also in terms of preventing Churchill's dumber ideas being put
Mm.
into place. As a collective unit, it's more important than the Bandits. They were important. They had big influences, and you can trace some of the very important strategic debates through what was going on there. But individually, they were important to Churchill, but that was their primary importance.
Mm.
Yes, when push turns to shove, the war effort would have gone on okay without any of
Mm. I think the other thing angle that I will end things is that, we're always bombarded as myself speaking as a middle-aged male about these things on social media about, don't forget to call up your mates and check on your mates' mental well-being and things like that, and take your mates out for a pint when they need it. With so much going on between 1939 1945, your book makes the point that these people were his friends on a purely human instinct of just being a bloke with a difficult job, be that coal mining, being a paramedic, or a prime minister. Are these friendships important to him just on that dynamic? Just the fact he can let his guard down and, I don't know, tell a naughty joke?
Absolutely. Well, they probably weren't the naughty joke type people, but they were people he understood. I think possibly he didn't quite get Beaverbrook, but certainly he knew Bracken and he knew Lindemann well. He knew what was going on there. He knew he could trust them. And trusting individuals is that you have around you that you can fall back on. It's slightly different to having complete serfs
Yeah.
in your circle. So psychologically, yes, they were important. Churchill knew that he could lift the phone and get something that would be familiar and be honest.
And I think that's a good place to leave it, because there are people watching this who are Churchill fans and some people who are probably Churchill, anti-Churchill. But at the end of the day, he is a human being. He was dealing with lots of things that we would be familiar with, of depression and his own mental well-being. And as you say, I mean, right place at the right time for World War II, but not a perfect individual, because none of us are. But Adrian, it's been absolutely delightful talking to you. I feel like I want to invite you back for a part 2 to talk about some of the other figures, because you're broadening my understanding of these dynamics, and it is fascinating to have a little look under the bonnet of the engine that was the British government in World War II, and realize that there are these incredibly important figures. So thank you for joining us. And folks, I will urge you to go and get Adrian's books, that certainly Winston's Bandits, but there's others there. They're in the description below. But if you would like to come back, I'll be very happy to have you, Adrian. It's been a fantastic chat.
I would be delighted again. No, it's been a blast. Really enjoyed it.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Well, folks, I'm back again tomorrow. We'd have our Operation Veritable panel discussion with the 3 Musketeers from Canada. I'm looking forward to that. And I've got shows all over the weekend this week, so no rest for the wicked. But in the meantime, don't forget to consider becoming a channel member or patron. Buy my guests' books. Go to their websites and follow what they do on Substack and social media, because it's important, because history is we need these people to keep sharing history with us. So thank you, everybody. I will see you all again tomorrow. Bye.
Bye.